Now I would like to invite Yang Berbahagia, Tan Sri Sharif Kasim, to commence the economic seminar on the Reform Programme for Dynamic Sustainable Development, jointly organized by the Jeffrey Cheah Institute and the Malaysian Economic Association. Tan Sri Sharif, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the attendance that we have today. It's quite good. As former president of the Malaysian Economic Association, I would like to extend our appreciation, the appreciation of the Malaysian Economic Association to the Jeffrey Cheah Institute for collaborating closely with us in holding a series of seminars on the Malaysian economy. We appreciate very much the facilities given to us to allow this seminars to be held, such as today. We also have close collaboration with the Penang Institute, and I think one or two of the sessions in this series of economic seminars was held in Penang. Today, the topic is the Reform Program for Dynamic Sustainable Development. And the speakers that we have today are Professor Jeffrey Cheah, Chairman of Jeffrey Cheah Center for Sustainable Development, Sunway University, Director, Center for Sustainable Development, Columbia University, Director, UN Sustainable Development Solutions Network. I think he's a family figure on CNN and world news, including The Economist, London. So I think he's a very well-known professor who has spoken a lot about sustainable development, the environment, dealing with the diseases, problem of diseases, especially in the poor countries, education, environment. And the other panelists that we have today are Tan Sri Dato' Dr. Kamal Saleh, Adjunct Professor of Economics and Development Studies, University of Malaya. Dato' Latifah Marikan unfortunately cannot make it for today's session. She has just come back from abroad. I hear she's not feeling very well. Hope she will get better soon. And we have Professor Wu Wing Tai, President, Jeffrey Cheah Institute of Southeast Asia. Now, I've been given a write-up on the profile of the three panel speakers, Professor Jeffrey Cheah, Tan Sri Dato' Dr. Kamal Saleh, Professor Wu Wing Tai. I think these are well-known personalities, so if you don't mind, I will skip reading the paper here. Now, I believe we are going to talk about the Malaysian economy and how far we have gone in implementing the new economic model, which was produced in 2010 to outline the program of reforms and changes that are required in the Malaysian economy. Now, to be sure, the government has implemented a number of reforms, especially since the 1997-1998 East Asian financial crisis. The banking and financial sector restructuring, which was led by the Ministry of Finance and Bank Negara Malaysia. Introduced a number of major changes to bring about, to strengthen the capital structure of our banking system and also its governance. Then we have the GLC transformation program, which was led by Khazanah Nasional Berhad. Basically, learning from the experience of what happened before, the program realized the need to strengthen the governance system among GLCs. If I may summarize, the objective is basically to take out the political control of GLCs. As you know, most GICs are under Ministry of Finance Incorporated. They account for a big proportion of the Malaysian economy. And during the East Asian financial crisis, the collapse of the Renong Group led to the collapse of the stock market. So it has huge importance for the Malaysian economy. So the GLC transformation program was designed to ensure that we do not repeat the past mistakes, especially in governance. Then the government launched the government transformation program, basically aimed at improving the delivery system of public services. And I think these results have been pretty impressive because, as you know, from the World Bank report, IMF report, they have acknowledged that there has been big improvement in the ease of doing business in Malaysia. And we have come up quite high in the chart compared in the international listing of countries' performance in facilitating the ease of doing business. Then in 2010, we have the new economic model report. Again, to be fair to the government, it has implemented the fiscal reforms recommended in the report. Abolition of fuel subsidies, because fuel subsidies were taking up a huge amount of the a higher percentage of the operating expenditure under the federal budget. It recommended the implementation of the value-added tax, which Malaysia renamed to call it GST. Since the implementation of the GST, I think it's fair to say that that played a major role in enabling the country to reduce the budget deficit. It used to be about 7 to 8% of GDP. It was threatening to go up some more, but since the fiscal measures were introduced, the budget deficit ratio has reduced to 4%, 3%. Now it's less than 3%. And I'm confident, like what many analysts are saying in the newspapers, that the government's announcement in the budget to reduce the budget deficit to 2.8%, is it? I'm confident that they can achieve, provided, of course, the economy grows as projected for 2018. I think they're talking about 5.5% to 6% growth for next year. But having said all this, I think there are still big questions to ask. Have we been able to address the hard reforms recommended in the new economic model? By hard reforms, I mean the structural reforms, and in particular, the new economic policy. As mentioned in the new economic model, the idea is that Malaysia should move towards a competitive economy, and therefore we should address the issues that impede Malaysian progress towards a competitive economy. Having said that, the new economic model recognizes the need for affirmative action for the poor, for the sick, for the aged. I think we should discuss whether Malaysia is moving seriously in that direction. Education and training, of course, is always an important subject in any seminar about Malaysian economy. Many of you from the education sector, you can give your opinions afterwards, how far we have gone on this very important topic. But having said all this, of course, all the macroeconomic fundamentals will not be effective unless the country is able to manage the social issues of race and religion. I belong to a group which has been in the forefront of bringing these issues up into the public domain. And I'm sure some of you may want to raise these issues. We have also talked, our group and also other civil society organizations have also raised about governance for transparency and accountability in the government. And I think this is another very important issue because in the end, what is important is building the trust between the government and the people. Once if your country goes in the situation where there is no trust between the government and the people, then I think it's going to be very difficult for the country to move forward. So without further ado, I would like to call Professor Jeffrey Cheah to address us. Then after that, we will have a panel discussion. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for having this wonderful seminar with the Malaysian Economic Association and the Jeffrey Cheah Center, which I can't say so easily each time, but always I say with the gratitude to Tan Sri Jeffrey Cheah for making it possible for me to have a home away from home and to be part of this wonderful institution and to have an opportunity to interact with the economists and the policy makers and policy thinkers from around this region. We've had 2 days of very exciting workshop as well with the leaders of mainly the planning agencies from around the region to talk about how to plan effectively for sustainable development. And I'll share some of that discussion in my brief remarks. I won't be long because I want to hear about Malaysia. Certainly, I'm not going to teach about Malaysia, so I want to hear about the deliberations here and enter into the discussion. But perhaps it will be helpful for me to give a few minutes of reflections about the world scene in which Malaysia is navigating. And it is a complicated time, certainly, where the contours of the global economy and of global politics are changing very, very rapidly. And all countries are searching for understanding these changing dynamics. So I'll say a few words about that. I think there are several conjoint and related stresses that are being experienced. It's probably always correct to start with, I was both saying thank you and feeling back at home, and also saying that as a prelude to what will be a very rich discussion about Malaysia, which I obviously won't start out with, I wanted to give a little bit of background of the global scene in which decisions need to be made now. And I wanted to start with what I regard as one of the three fundamental factors at play, quite obviously at play, but very deeply transforming the world economy and policymaking, and that is the technological revolution that is underway. It is a revolution that is accelerating, actually probably beyond our real understanding at this point. Broadly speaking, we can say it's the digital revolution that got underway already 75 years ago with the advent of modern computation, and then added modern connectivity and the internet, and now is in a phase of dramatic machine learning and artificial intelligence. And unless one is absolutely at the core of these developments, it's impossible to keep up with how dynamic they are right now. Perhaps the startling illustration of that was the recent paper published last week by the company DeepMind, which is a Google Alphabet company, which is the artificial intelligence unit that created AlphaGo, the machine learning system that became the world champion of Go. And you recall last year, of course, that AlphaGo beat the reigning greatest Go champion of the world at the time, the European Go champion Lee Sedol, who on the eve of the competition predicted that he would, of course, triumph decisively over the machine, but that we would all learn something from the experience. And then the machine turned out to decisively defeat the Go champion, accomplishing something that was considered beyond the reach of artificial intelligence. That was a year ago. At the beginning or at the end of last year, in an online round-robin competition that takes place each year with the Go champions, AlphaGo beat all of the reigning Go champions of the world 50-0 in the online round-robin competition. Well, last week, AlphaGo was defeated 100 matches to nothing by the next generation of smart machine called AlphaGo Zero. And this is reported in this week's Nature magazine. Now, what's absolutely extraordinary about this, that to my mind gives us a sense of this revolution, is that the new generation of machine, which used a new kind of learning process, reinforcement learning, had no inputs from Go champions, from Go masters, or from champion games that had been played, the kind of information, data that had been inputted into AlphaGo's system design last year. In this case, the new machine was only programmed with the rules of Go. And then it was programmed to play against itself hundreds of thousands of times over a 72-hour period and learn along the way through a deep neural network machine learning algorithm. So with no knowledge from outside, no guidance, no expertise of champions, no background, except the rules of the game itself, this monster machine played 1 million matches and then proceeded to challenge AlphaGo, the reigning world champion machine, and won 100 matches to 0. Well, I imagine I'm going to be put out of a job very soon, and probably that's true of the rest of us, because this is really a stunning display of a new kind of smart machine. It applies in specific circumstances. It's not absolutely generalized, but it shows what has now been recognized over the last 15 years in a variety of ways, is this accelerated artificial intelligence through statistical machine learning, the power of that to be able to carry out tasks that were absolutely considered to be human only and beyond the capacity of machines. And now with this new demonstration, not even needing the human to really instruct the machine, because in this particular case, the machine was able to instruct itself in a pure play. Well, these changes are transforming all aspects of the economy and society in ways that are very hard, at least for me, to understand, except the feeling that the transformations are coming fast and deep. The companies that are already deploying this kind of machine learning and artificial intelligence, the so-called big data portals, the 5 largest of these companies, Amazon, Alphabet or Google, Apple, Facebook, and Microsoft, are now the 5 most valuable companies in the world in market capitalization, way ahead of little companies like ExxonMobil and the oil giants, not to mention companies like General Motors, which are tiny now compared to these companies. And last week, as AlphaGo Zero was taking the reigning championship of the Go world, all 5 of the IT giants reported surges of earnings, and their market cap rose several percent. And so as of today, the combined market capitalization of these 5 companies is $3.2 trillion, which is not a small amount of money, even for macroeconomic scale. And so we're seeing a profound transformation of the economic space. We're also probably witnessing a profound transformation of the political space, because big data probably played a role in the two political upsets of last year, and they were upsetting indeed, the election of Donald Trump and Brexit. It is claimed that the same big data company, Cambridge Analytica, played a central role in both of these political upheavals. This is a company which claims to have personalized data of more than 230 million Americans, and the claim is that it was able to use Facebook, Google, Twitter to micro-target social messaging on behalf of Trump and thereby win a very narrow election. It's also supposed by some that maybe this was done in conjunction with the Russian government, so there may be some part of that story as well. And all of this means that we don't even understand our politics anymore in this fast-changing technological world. Or if we don't, let me just say I don't, because every day is a new surprise in how these events are unfolding. These companies, of course, none of them existed other than Microsoft 20 years ago. Didn't exist at all, or only in an embryonic way, and certainly did not dominate the industrial space 10 years ago. And so these are truly dramatic changes. One could note also that simultaneously with these events of last week also was the 19th Party Congress in China, and President Xi Jinping's report to the Party Congress, it was filled with China's commitment to technological mastery in these new areas. And so China's industrial policy, which is of world-changing significance without question, focuses on the same technological revolutions, and China, in many different dimensions of its industrial policy, is planning and already achieving at least, I would say, competitive equality with the United States in many areas of advanced information technology, robotics, and is vying for leadership in advanced semiconductors, in supercomputation, and in other areas. So these technologies are, of course, at the very center of global economic competition and geopolitical competition as well. So that's the technological revolution that shapes and is changing all of our perspectives. I would say that the geopolitical changes underway are equally amazing, and of course, as I just said, closely related to this. China, as we know, has become the world's largest economy as of the last 5 years. And to my mind, the steps that China is now taking economically are going to solidify that lead. If I compare the governance in the United States and China today, I would say that Chinese governance is clearly superior in thinking ahead, clearly aiming strategically at technological advance and industrial preeminence, and ready to invest heavily in achieving that preeminence. In the United States, by contrast, our elites are, well, some we don't understand them at all, and others we understand that their main goal is tax cuts, which is really the passion of American politics. But we have no discussion in the United States right now about, other than defensive discussion of what did Russia do to us in the election campaign, but very little discussion about a forward-looking industrial strategy, about the role of government together with the private sector in fostering further scientific advances, and so on. Most of what's happening in the U.S. is anti-scientific, cutting science spending, denying climate change for the convenience of political actors in the oil and gas industry, and generally unable to look forward. We also have no planning agency and no planning mechanisms in the United States, and this is becoming more and more of a serious liability in terms of the capacity of the U.S. to adjust in a serious way. So my view is that we're in an era where China's preeminence will continue to grow, where Asia's centrality in the world economy will continue to rise, and where the role of the U.S., though it will remain obviously very powerful militarily and powerful economically and financially, will continue to decline. And that is a period that is unsettling, to say the least. Not because I think that there's anything wrong with that change of relative power. I don't at all. I think it's just part of a general convergence of economics and technology around the world, part of a long historical process. But it does mean that global governance is in a very complicated state of affairs now. The U.S., for a fleeting moment, boasted that it was a unipolar world with the end of the Cold War. This is clearly was fanciful from the beginning, but we're certainly not in a unipolar world at this point. We're in a very much a multipolar world, and in a period of huge governance flux, because the United States not only has declined in relative terms dramatically, but is also unable and unwilling politically to lead internationally in almost any way other than in the military sphere. And the military leadership is not very cogent or satisfying or convincing as well. It's actually rather terrifying most days. And so we're really in a, from a global governance point of view, in a very unusual period, but also at the end of a 300-year period of Western dominance, and certainly in an era where the centrality of Asia is, I think, being reasserted for the long term, for the foreseeable future. The third complicating factor in all of this, of course, is the environmental crisis, which is an unpleasant intruder to the scene because the world was a lot simpler when the big questions were economics and politics. And where did the environment come from in that? And I would say till today, most economic and military and geopolitical strategists don't pay too much attention to the environment because they weren't trained to do so when they studied international relations or when they studied economics, and they were trained to study statecraft and power, military balance, diplomacy, but the environment was a footnote to them. It's quite clear, however, that we've reached the moment when environmental concerns are no longer a footnote. They're absolutely central to our basic human concerns. As I was coming in today, I saw just an alert of a new paper published in The Lancet today describing how climate change is already leading to public health crises all over the world, not in prospect, but already occurring because of the intensification of spread of diseases like dengue fever, newly emerging diseases which are emerging in the wake of global warming, the heat waves, the droughts, the other natural disasters that are occurring because of global warming. And these are intensifying dramatically. The last few weeks has been an object lesson for us in the United States, of course. We had 5 major hurricanes come within a 4-week period with devastating results. Again, we learned what we keep learning, which is we're unable to protect ourselves against these disasters and unable to recover effectively from them. Puerto Rico is still without electricity in large parts of the island 5 weeks later, and the situation is horrific. I spoke to the governor of Puerto Rico a few days ago, and the situation is absolutely dramatic because even the technical aspects of getting the power grid back on are beyond the management capacities of the island and of the United States itself right now. We had the worst forest fires in modern history in California in recent weeks, and this is because of the prolonged droughts that had hit California in recent years. Yesterday, it was revealed in a new study that the jump of the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere of 3.3 parts per million this past year was the highest ever. So we reached 403.3 parts per million CO2. This is the highest concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere of the last 800,000 years. And the increase from 400 parts per million last year, in other words, 3.3 parts per million, was a dramatic acceleration, indicating that the capacity of the terrestrium and the oceans to absorb CO2 is perhaps diminishing because of global warming. So many scientists fear that we could be reaching a tipping point where natural buffers are disappearing. You know, when we emit carbon dioxide, it's roughly 1/2 of the CO2 gets absorbed quickly in natural sinks, both in ocean waters and in carbon in land, in the soils, and in plants. But it's possible that those natural sinks lose their capacity to absorb the CO2 with higher temperatures. We know that the rainforests, when they dry and are warmer, become net emitters of carbon dioxide rather than net reservoirs of CO2. And so it's possible that we're reaching a tipping point where there could be runaway CO2 increases in future years. It's very, very close. And even if we don't have that runaway tipping point of carbon dioxide, the sheer magnitude of human emissions of CO2 from fossil fuel use and from continued forest destruction that amounts to about 40 billion tons of CO2 emitted each year is at a rate which will cause us to surpass the Paris climate targets of staying below, well below 2 degrees C warming, probably in a quarter of a century. And so unless we decisively decarbonize the energy system, we will not only overshoot the global warming, but potentially with catastrophic consequences of the kind that we're seeing. So these, I believe, are the three big conditioning realities that every country faces: a massive technological revolution, a dramatically changing geopolitics, and an environmental crisis, which even in the best of times would be very hard to face, because the time dimension of addressing the environmental crisis would force us to adjust our energy and agricultural systems at an unprecedented rate. The evidence is we essentially have to be out of fossil fuels by mid-century to remain within what are deemed to be the safe carbon limits. Can you imagine Malaysia out of fossil fuels, not only not using them domestically, but not exporting them, not living off of oil and gas exports? It's hard to imagine. Nobody really believes it. American politics is in complete denial. Donald Trump's trying to restore our bankrupt coal industry. It's the only good thing that's happened environmentally is that coal went out of business, which it should everywhere, because there's no place for coal in a safe environment in the future. But politically, we're still in denial, even as these disasters occur. And in the United States, the politics is so toxic that if a natural disaster hits, I inevitably make some statement, well, this is the kind of danger that we're facing. And then you're yelled at by the American right wing because they say, don't politicize a disaster. So there's no time ever to talk about these things, because when the public has attention to the disaster, you're not supposed to talk about it. And when the public doesn't have attention to it, you're supposed to happily burn fossil fuels. Of course, this is a political game of financial interests involved. It's not serious debate. But it shows how difficult it is for us to make these changes. Well, what are the implications for Malaysia? I should sit down and listen at this point, but I'll just make a few comments. I think the biggest implication is that standing still is no option for any place on the planet. Unless economies are dynamic and part of the technological change, they will absolutely be left behind. So there's no standing still. And my biggest advice to every country is be part of this massive industrial revolution that's underway, the data revolution, the information revolution. Master it, incorporate it, understand the risks as well. But every part of business will either accommodate the smart machines, the robotics, the artificial intelligence, the e-commerce, or be left behind. And I think that the pace of technological change is going to continue to accelerate, in fact. And it's hard to think of any sector where this is not going to have huge effects. agriculture, mining, and industry will continue to be increasingly automated. I don't believe in large employment remaining in the goods-producing sectors. Probably the mining sector everywhere will be almost without miners in the future because of almost everything being subject to automation. But that's true of agriculture as well. In the United States, our total farm sector is down to about 0.7% of the workforce. And it's a very big productive agriculture, but it's all produced by smart tractors and smart machines, not by farmers anymore. We have very, very few farmers, except in very particular sectors and very seasonal. And so the job consequences are absolutely huge. I think we're about to go through a period where the retail sector is completely transformed with the massive loss of jobs as well in the United States and probably in most places, because e-commerce will, Amazon can do with a fifth of the employment or less what the retail sector has traditionally done. And I don't see any sign of that slowing. It's all becoming more sophisticated, more on-time delivery, no need for shops, no need for clerks, even when there are shops, no need for checkout counters. This, I think, is a trend that's going to continue. As I said, I don't think there will be much need for economists either soon. For professors, will probably be online mostly, the whole nature of education, I think, also will be deeply affected by the technologies. So that's one part. Second is the geopolitics. I believe that China's power and influence in this region will continue to grow, understandably. I'm a believer in the One Belt, One Road vision. It's partly a program and partly a vision, but I think it's a big deal. And I think that just as the U.S. between the 1950s and 1980s organized a lot of global production, I think that China's economy will be playing a role something like that over the next 25 years. Probably China will not assume unique dominance in the world because also India will grow rapidly, and ASEAN has a lot of people and it will develop. So I'm not thinking of this as a China-led world, but I'm thinking of it as a world in which China is the dominant economy, the largest single economy, and still with huge savings, huge investment, and a huge reason for building an integrated infrastructure with Southeast Asia and indeed throughout Eurasia. And so I think that this is a major fact of life that on the whole is very, very positive, assuming the region remains peaceful and cooperative, which is, of course, absolutely vital. So I would take that as a second major consideration. Third, I don't know whether we will get around in time to being environmentally smart. We're sitting in a place that is a tribute to environmental sustainability, to Jeffrey Cheah's vision that you can take a used mining site and turn it into a major real estate development and resort area and theme parks and university centers and so forth. So that's the vision of what smart sustainable development means. whether we're going to be so smart in general. That's why we have to work hard to propagate the lessons and the message. But just look at the United States. We're not always so smart, right? And so I'm not sure whether we're going to get the message in time. But from the point of view of strategy for Malaysia, I would certainly count on the world moving to sustainable technologies. Malaysia's not been in the forefront of renewable energy up until now. It's very much a fossil fuel-based economy, but I think it's time to really accelerate, and I know that that's part of the strategy. But what I recommend to all governments is a very serious analysis of what deep decarbonization really means. Do the thought experiment, twofold thought experiment. First, what would Malaysia have to do to have a fully modern, high energy economy without carbon emissions by mid-century? What are the renewable energy assets? How can they best be tapped? What kind of technologies are needed? What kind of regional cooperation would be important and facilitative? And second, what if Malaysia loses international markets for the hydrocarbons in the future because the whole world moves to electric vehicles and to wind, solar, nuclear, and other technologies and isn't buying hydrocarbons in the future? What does it mean for Indonesia not to export coal? Because I think coal is basically finished as a viable energy source and needs to be finished. What would it mean for the economies of the region? Do the thought experiment very, very carefully. And then probably implement. Because even though there's some political uncertainty about this, my own view is that we're obviously at the end of the debate about how risky and dangerous climate change is, because we see with our own eyes every day, every week, that this is very dangerous and getting worse. We're not really having a scientific debate anymore. We're into the sheer politics of the hydrocarbon industry and the coal industry trying to survive. But the fact of the matter is that it should basically plan on closing. And while not closing immediately, it should be planning on phasing out by mid-century. When I tell that to executives of ExxonMobil, they don't quite believe me that they're going to be a footnote to history soon. But I actually believe they will be, because I don't really see the role. And it's interesting that while Saudi Arabia basically lives on hydrocarbons, of course, even the rhetoric now is that they have to move beyond hydrocarbons, and that's coming from the Crown Prince, and as the strategy, it's going to be a lot harder than they think, because that country has, of course, been at its absolute core built on oil and gas. But I think the sentiment is correct that this is the end of that period. So that's not very specific advice, but it does mean that I think these are the contexts that need to be taken seriously into account. Maybe I'll say a couple further things and then stop. Everything I've talked about is medium term. I haven't really said much about business cycles, financial crisis, short-run growth. And that's because I believe that looking to 20 or 30 or 40-year time horizons is the right time horizon for national planning and for national strategy. And while a 20-year or 25-year plan needs 5-year milestones and 1-year budgets, and you have to live in real time, keeping a longer term perspective, I think, is absolutely essential. And it has been the source of China's strength in the last 30 years. There's been an underlying consistency of economic strategy and an ability to implement a long-term strategy and to invest heavily. And maybe the single metric of that is that saving rates have been about half of national income consistently. Now they're maybe about 45% of China's national income. That really means looking to the future rather than taking short-term decisions. So I do think that any strategy for Malaysia isn't a 5-year plan or a 5-year cycle. It's a 20 or 25-year vision, but one that's very much embedded in these fundamental trends. I think a couple more things that go along with that. One is the absolute foundation for success has to be the quality of education and therefore the quality of the knowledge and skills of the people. And that's a long-term process as well. But everywhere I go, I say that of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, SDG 4, which is on quality education, is the most important of all, because it's not possible to be part of this technological revolution. It's not possible even to have social peace if the population is not well educated. And one of the reasons, by the way, that the United States is so unusually unstable right now, which it is that we have a massive educational divide in the country. Basically, people with a college degree are doing fine and generally are aghast at Mr. Donald Trump, and people with a high school degree are not doing fine at all and form the core support for Trump as a kind of political reaction. They're not getting much help from him, quite the contrary, but still that's what the political divide signifies. And if you rank the US states by the share of the adult population with a bachelor's degree, of the 19 states with the highest bachelor degree percentages, 18 of them voted for Hillary Clinton. And of the 32 states with the lowest penetration of bachelor's degrees in the population, 30 of them voted for Donald Trump. So the country almost completely divided by education level, and that is our underlying social phenomenon, but I think it is an economic and political reality, and especially here economics, that quality education for all children is the baseline for all longer term policies. Last point I want to make is that we should be taking care not only of the environment, but of the quality of our lives, and especially there is an aging population everywhere. Malaysia's median age will rise from around 28 years now to almost 50 years by the end of the century. Societies are aging, and that also means that the kind of planning we need to do is planning for quality of life. And I mention this because even today, while Malaysia still is very much committed to raising per capita income levels and reaching new levels, this is a country that by any standard of history, is already a high-income country, where there is already a high degree of prosperity that has been broadly achieved, a level that would be, say, unimaginable a century ago in this country. And one of the things clearly is we should use this prosperity not only for further advances and for technological advances, but also to enjoy life and to raise the well-being of people. Every year I put out a report with colleagues called the World Happiness Report, and I think it's very instructive. It's based on a survey asking people around the world how happy they are, that Gallup International undertakes, but in a way that the social psychologists have shown to be a quite meaningful, not a flippant reaction, but a quite meaningful measure of what is called subjective well-being. The countries that are happiest in the world actually are the geographic corner of Northern Europe. Consistently, Norway, Sweden, Denmark come out at the very top of the list, the Scandinavian countries. What do they do differently from other countries? They spend a great deal of time on the quality of life, in ensuring a fair distribution of income, ensuring that basic services at a high quality are available for everybody, of giving every mother a year of leave time with a newborn child, and a father 9 months or a year of leave time with a newborn child, ample family support, especially for poor families to be able to raise their children, and 6 weeks vacation every year too. So they really like their vacation. Try to find a Swede in August. It's impossible, except if you have a phone number to a sailboat. So they really, in a little sailboat, not a 300-foot yacht, just a little boat, they really enjoy life. And they use their wealth and prosperity. They pay a lot of taxes, and they use those taxes to provide a lot of social services. And I believe, and I'll stop here, that we should all do the same. In the US, the Wall Street Journal, which is a very nasty newspaper actually, on the editorial page, because it's owned by Rupert Murdoch, who's a very nasty man, who's able to earn a lot of money, but he's not a nice person, and he does not run nice organizations, mocks the Europeans. Oh, they don't work, and we don't want to be like that. And it's true that Americans are working about 300 hours a year more than Europeans. That's 7 or 8 weeks longer, actually. It's quite amazing. But it shows Americans are not as happy. We're nervous wrecks. There's actually an opioid epidemic underway. There are rising death rates. We elect people like Donald Trump, which is not a sign of happiness, by the way. We should take a note about that. So I want to end by saying, use the rising economy for the quality of life here, not just for the sake of more rise in economy. And we do have ample resources. And this is a beautiful country and a wonderful geography and wonderful nature. And it really doesn't pay to lose sight of all of that. Waste the nature, destroy the nature, and ruin everybody's lives through an endless focus on all of the competitiveness and so forth, when we have the wherewithal to help support quality of lives for everybody. Thank you very much.
Taking us through the global issues that Malaysia will have to take into account as we plan for the country's development. You might want to know that about 3 weeks ago, Khazanah Megatrends seminar, the topic of that 2-day seminar was about the disruptive technology. Because I think the objective is to inform Malaysians that this is happening. Artificial intelligence, disruptive technology, big data, all this is going to transform the way business is done and the way people lead their life. A lot of disruption, but there's also a lot of opportunities. For example, it's mentioned in the seminar that nowadays in the US, you can really set up office for business for as little as $50. Not like in the old days where you had to go around, borrow from the bank in order to set up office. Of course, Malaysia has to take into account the implications of all what Professor Jeffrey Cheah mentioned, which means that we cannot afford to stand still. We have to take note of the geopolitics, especially in this region led by China and its One Belt, One Road initiative. Malaysia has to accelerate the policy on renewable energy. It has to pay attention to quality of education, and it has to start planning for the aging of the population. I think our colleagues in Khazanah Research Institute and in the Employees Provident Fund, they're really seriously talking about this issue, and hopefully they will come out with concrete recommendations for the government to consider. Tan Sri Datuk Dr. Kamal Saleh is also a familiar figure in dialogue sessions, seminars, and conferences in Kuala Lumpur. He is a founder of the International Medical University, graduate from Monash University, and obtained his master's and doctorate from University of Pennsylvania. He is a very eloquent speaker, so he tells me that he won't need any slides, so he's going to talk off the cuff.
And I would like to thank both Sunway University and the MEA for this honor to be on this panel with Jeffrey Cheah, whom by reputation and personally I know sometime, he doesn't remember, at a breakfast time in Palace House. He was asked the question by the Prime Minister, this was about 4 years ago, I think. What would it need for Malaysia to become a developed country? And one of his conclusions was that you have to quadruple your R&D budget from less than 1% to about 4% of GDP. And if we had spent that money, probably we would have been far up the technological stages of the new industrialization than we are now. We are still, both in terms of human capital as well as in terms of the engineers and scientists we need, and the kind of competencies like big data analytics that we need to produce manpower for, which we are now beginning to allocate some money for through Purnaraju and so on. If you had listened to his advice about 4 or 5 years ago, maybe even it was in 2008, I think it was, then we have been much better off at this stage to meet the challenges that he has outlined just now to us. I thank you for that. It's ironic that I'm speaking here today on the last day of my adjunct professorship in MU at Sunway University. Tan Sri, don't worry, I'm not looking or angling for a job here. I think it's time to retire, I suppose. But on this subject, I still am quite fully engaged because I don't think you start thinking about things that are going on in our own country over the last 60 years of experience, you can really sleep soundly as an academic. You seems to be pushed to continue to try to understand how things are going and where are we going, what needs to be done, and you can try only in your little ways to try and make a difference, and so you cannot retire as such. But the issues that faces us in terms of the new economic model that was implemented over the last maybe 10 years now is a continuation of some of the reforms that were started in Pala's administration. But he did leave it to the last minute. Otherwise, we probably would have been able to have a better institutional basis for moving on to the NEP, to the NEM, which replaces the NEP, by the way. And in our recent study 2 years ago for the UNDP, we have said that there's no more place for racism in any economic policy going forward into the future. And if we do still play the race card, maybe in politics, but if we do it in economics, we will continue to be retarded in our growth process and prospects. So in that context, that study showed that in fact inequality in the country, as an example of the importance of the social sustainability of the country and its peculiar political economic situation, which had been defined ethnically, our data shows that basically the disparities amongst our people is no longer due to race factors. The ethnic inequality or contribution to inequality is only 5% of total inequality of incomes. 95% is due to differences amongst the people themselves in terms of income. So it has become a class issue between rich and poor, those who have and those who have not. The Palmer Index is at 7 times, which by a more fairer society should be around 3 to 4 as a factor. So in other words, the difference between the richest 10% and the bottom 50% is still very huge. And this is one of the major challenges of the new economic model, which he was trying to address by the B40 approach, the so-called inclusiveness approach, which is not complete. The only way you can deal with the B40 approach or with the B40 solution as an inclusive strategy is in fact to improve income distribution amongst the population. Whatever your dimensions of regional, ethnic, gender, whatever. In the end, the question is, as Professor Sachs says, the quality of our workforce, the creativity of our people, the integrity of our institutions, including political, and so on. So there are big challenges. To me, the only address I can make to this so-called reform or review of the NEM is that we need a new economic model. And we're working on that. One of the issues is to do with the fact that up until now, labor compensation is only about 32% of total gross national income. For an advanced country, which we assume we will reach by 2020, and there's no reason why, at least on one dimension, GDP or GNI per capita, we will not reach that bottom rung of the developed status. But in terms of the compensation to labor, it is still only about 20 to 30% short of that developed country status, where the share of income of labor, the functional distribution of income, labor enjoys about nearly 50 to 55% of total general national income, which means that the rich are still becoming rich. And this is a global phenomenon. This happens in the United States. As Stiglitz says, the economy is 1% by the 1% for the 1%. it is a global phenomenon, this inequality issue, and this is still with us. And we are still bugged by the differences between ethnicity, when in fact it is no longer between races, but between peoples with different levels of competencies. And the challenge of the future under Industry 4.0, basically, whether it is the digital revolution or the bioeconomy expectations and so on, and those demands that we have signed, we have agreed as a nation to the Conference of Parties to the United Nations Framework for Climate Change Convention. There are challenges that Professor Sachs raised, which makes it even more complicated for us. We can no longer continue to appropriate from nature, which is very bountiful insofar as we have been concerned, but it adds to the environmental costs. And we have to now find ways whereby can we produce jet fuel, for instance, which is mandated in Europe for any plane to land in a European airport. The use of hydrocarbon as fuel, that means jet fuel, which is essentially kerosene, a derivative of the refining of crude oil, will mean that we have to find ways to do so. But we have the means to do it, we can plant it, but there is a proviso that you must not substitute growing for fuel versus opening land for food. There must not be a conflict between the two. So this is the kind of challenges that we have to address. The fact that we have been growing palm oil, and Jomo says palm oil is the future for Malaysia, we cannot extend that growth of that palm oil because the land, well, maybe Sabah Sarawak still has got some, but all eyes are looking at palm oil. And the more we clear forests for palm oil, the more we are going to be essentially taxed against our production and exports. And long run, people know that, and not well known, I suppose, that the water table in our country has been permanently reduced. And that will eventually contribute to our future water crisis, especially with more climatic change and affecting droughts and so on, where there were none before. I mean, water is not a problem in Malaysia, but it is, our rivers are polluted and our groundwaters are going down, and we are depending on rain that goes to the wrong places and falls in the wrong places at the wrong time when we need them. So that's the kind of sustainability challenges that we face from an environmental point of view as we address the issues of economic policy and income distribution and social justice. So to me, let me just quote you some of the challenges. We are in, say, steel production. This is based on the input-output table of 2010. That was produced by Stats Department, that was used to try and understand, to project for the steel industry in Perak. And Vale was commissioned that study. Vale is a Brazilian iron and steel company. The value added for Malaysia in terms of their input-output for steel is 7% value added. For Taiwan, it is 20%. And for Korea, it's probably higher than that. In other words, our industrialization and our industrial production, as is known in terms, even in electronics and so on, the value added is very low. So how do you then increase productivity and therefore increase wages in order to effect better distribution of income, at least in functional terms, if not in social terms, between the various groups in our country? So that's one of the sort of, if you start from the fact, then you move forward to try and find a solution vis-a-vis the overall policy, you have to begin to go back to the fundamental analytics. Secondly, for instance, we are concerned right now about GST and its impact on cost of living and affecting the bottom 40%. Our models of intervention are still the same as it was done 50 years ago when we talk about RIDA and then MARA and the Rural Development Ministry allocations for different projects and so on. We are still doing the same thing, implementing them, and therefore we are we are still standing still, basically, in respect of poverty eradication. Although we have reduced absolute poverty to about nearly zero by the year 2020, hopefully. But relative poverty will still be there, and relative poverty in this case is measured by the B40. The only way we found via some of our basic analysis for UNDP recently, the only way you can solve the B40 problem, because there will always be the B40 problem with you, is to get people out of B40 into M40 and of course upwards, meaning it can only be solved by a better income distribution and not by pure transfers or subsidies to the poor. And that means you have to better educate them. You have to teach them how to fish and not just keep giving them fish, aka brim, and so on. So therefore, it makes our income distribution look nice. It dropped from 0.44 to 0.01. I'm sorry, Dr. That was too drastic a fall, which took us 20 years to bring from 0.46 or 0.45 to 0.443 under the 9th Measure Plan. And suddenly, by the time of the end of the 11th Measure Plan, we are 0.40. And now, of course, it's 0.339. I mean, we cannot, I mean, academics, independent academics don't believe that that drop could have happened, except, and maybe you can justify it, that the introduction of the minimum wage has in fact affected income distribution. The Gini coefficient we studied for UNDP improved by about 4% as a result of the introduction, and we told that to the Economic Council. Dr. Sinaji was chairing, that yes, your minimum wage has got that impact on income distribution. But BRIM, only 0.04% affecting the income distribution. So BRIM is not sustainable, not only because it is not have no impact, but also the cost of supporting BRIM would be unsustainable, especially when you have to rely on DGST to support the deficit. And the recent budget of 2.8 against what was said or warned by World Bank of 2.8% of GDP is certainly still people are arguing about whether that is really realizable or not, especially when the World Bank itself says that your actual deficit might be 3.5% by the end of the year or by the end of next year if you're not too careful. Especially now, you're only doing a sleight of hand, moving the cost from the left pocket to the right pocket. So all the budget that you normally apply to a development budget, which has been declining ratio-wise or percentage-wise relative to total budget, now it's about only 9% from like 30% about 10 years ago. Most of that cost of so-called development and infrastructure spending and so on has been shifted to the off-budget agencies, and they are carrying the baby. And that means you are talking about not the fact that the national debt is at a certain level still manageable, around 55 to 60%. If you put in with contingent liabilities of the type that's carried over by the off-budget agencies, you are about talking about 80% of GDP, which is national debt. And that means that while still manageable relative to our growth output, the future generations, the rate of growth of that debt is critical. And over the last 10 years, that rate of growth of the national debt has been very rapid compared to previous 20, 30 years. So these kind of nuances of the macroeconomics of things that you have to begin to understand and therefore deal with in trying to find a new model. So those are just two examples. I don't want to go further on this, but basically I am hoping that we can find ways in which we can raise, we can move towards a high wage economy. I mean, Singapore tried and Singapore succeeded, but only in certain ways. But Tun Mahathir announced it 30 years ago. He didn't try hard enough. In fact, he lowered the power of collective bargaining in order to reduce and therefore the decline of what they call trade union density, such that arguments for higher wages had been dampened, and wages are still quite low, and that's why we have the brain drain. And how do you reverse the brain drain? Can only be by incentivizing them to come back with better salaries. And even our professionals, our doctors are hardworking, but they are in fact paid very low. Even teachers' salaries are low relative to more developed countries, percentage-wise. So these are some of the things that I think we have to understand. Don't forget about rhetoric and what the traditional media says. Look at even social media. Some are fake news, but you at least get to see that the argument begin to work. I just read yesterday a thesis that was submitted testing the role of social media, and this is quite critical for the coming elections. It had confirmed that since 2008 election and 2013 election, that social media is the one that has influenced voter behavior and therefore changes, and has led to the fact that the government lost its popular majority, popular vote. But now this the next G14, big data, has been employed by both sides. The BN has employed Cambridge Analytica that was referred to by Jeffrey Cheah, whereas on the opposition side, FCC has got his Invoke group looking at also big data analytics to see to fine tune voter messaging. So we live in interesting times, but I say it is also dangerous times. So be careful. Thank you.
Thank you, Tan Sri Kamel Saleh. Yes, I think one of the biggest challenges facing this country is about raising the share of wages in the economy. I believe the current plan talks about a target of 40%, to raise it to 40%, which is about the norm for developed countries. We are still below that. I think we are around 32%. So I think this is a major issue which will occupy a lot of the thinking for the next plan. Now, may I call upon Professor Wu?
In Jeff Sachs tells us that we should live life and be happy about it. I agree that it is not necessary to be rich in order to be happy. But I say, if you could be happy when you are poor, think of how much happier you will be if you can afford the latest medical advances so that your parents can live in good health up to 100 years old. And how much happier you would be if you are able to afford to give your kid the best education that is available in the world. Both of them, in order to afford first world education, in order to afford first world medical care, you got to get a first world income. It is not surprising that the Scandinavians are happy because their productivity is among the highest in the world. And I'm saying a prerequisite for even greater happiness is to be able to have higher productivity. I'm happy to report, well, in the last earlier 3 seminars in this series, many recommendations have been forwarded by the list of our speakers. They range widely from, they range quite widely. And I'm happy to report to you that in the spirit of constant self-improvement, some government ministries have been paying attention to what we have been saying. For example, Dwight Perkins thinks that the slow growth of Malaysia has been due to the inability of our university to equip our graduates with ability to be entrepreneurial and innovative, and basically not being able to engage in critical thinking. Well, that was certainly a claim which was rightly defended, rebutted by the Ministry of Higher Education and several vice chancellors who have pointed out that Malaysia has really put in some very expensive programs to produce innovative students. So given this disagreement, this is clearly a research agenda that JCI will embark upon. But let the facts speak for themselves on how well we've been doing. The first number we put in mind is from 1970 to 1997, Malaysia has been growing at 7.7%. And the 10 years before the Asian financial crisis, we grew at 9.3%. So it is not surprising, therefore, that in 2001, Mahathir predicted that given that we know how to fix financial crisis, there wouldn't be one in the next 10 years. Well, that turns out to be wrong because 2008 happened in America. But he expected the growth rate to be 7.5. Given the fact that the past was 7.7 or 9.3 in recent memory, Mahathir was being exceedingly modest to have picked a number that was much lower. Well, as things shown up, since the beginning of the 2000s, Malaysia has slowed down. The first 5-year plan in the 21st century gave us an average growth rate of 4.5. Then the next 5 years was 4.2, 5.3, and we have an uptick recently of 5.2, but still quite a major distance away from 7.5. So there's a new normal in the Malaysian economy. But is it something that is beyond our ability to change? Clearly, the mechanism for that big slowdown is the drop in private investment in Malaysia. Private investment in Malaysia let's take at 1990 as the base. And look at 2010 for comparison. We will see that total investment had dropped, and the biggest drop in investment is in the private sector. Basically, the private sector has stopped investing to the same degree of enthusiasm as before, and hence the economy has grown slower. And why is that so? As I said, there have been a whole list of the usual suspects. Dwight Perkins pointing out that it's the education sector. It's also popular to say that maybe it was the NEP with its quotas. And some people say incompetent governance, and some people would point to decline in ability of public administration and so forth. But that actually flies in the face of evidence. Because during the time when the NEP was in effect, which is 1970 to 1997, growth was 7.7. So how could something that has no impact during the early years start having an impact later? And furthermore, if you look at indexes, international indexes of performance of the Malaysian government, the competence level has certainly not gone down. And in fact, if you get the various measures of a Malaysian business atmosphere, it has remained unchanged, if not improved. So what has happened? I think that what has happened is that Malay is exactly what Dr. Kamal Saleh said. We are doing the same thing, but the world has changed on us. And because the world has changed on us, the same medicine no longer works. And what is that? In order to see what the change is, we got to explain why that we had high growth in 1977 and what was it about the change that has occurred. I think the best way to think of Malaysian economic growth is what I call the bathtub theory. Think of Malaysia's growth rate as being propelled by the level of investment. The level of investment is like the level of water in a bathtub. But in the case of Malaysia, there are two things, there are two leaks at the bottom of the bathtub. One leak is called capital flight. Malaysia has the 4th largest capital flight in the world. But on a per capita basis, well, on a per capita, the largest is China, second is Mexico, third is Malaysia is third. I forgot, this is the 4th. The highest is China, but China on a per capita basis is roughly $300 per person per year. In the case of Mexico, it's $400 per person per year. In the case of Malaysia, it's $2,720 per person per year. So they have this tub that's been leaking water. And at the same time, the World Bank tells us that 20% of the educated labor force has left the country. I mean, bachelor's degree and above have left the country. So we have got a brain drain problem that has also been identified. So how is it possible for a country to grow at 7.7 as brain drain and huge capital flight? The reason is because in 1970, globalization arrived and the tap of foreign direct investment came in and filled the tank up. So as the leaks happened, the flow of water came in. But in 2000, when China joined WTO, that flow of FDI was diverted. And that is when Malaysia's private investment fell. And that a lot has to do with the drop in foreign direct investment. Given the fact that there's not much Malaysia could do to change the external conditions, there are things that Malaysia must do internally. Clearly, as Professor Kamal has said, while playing the race card is maybe useful in politics, it's certainly not useful in economic management. But there are other flaws as well. There is one institutional fix which I think is exceedingly important. I think the institutional fix that needs is to reduce the amount of centralization in governance in this country. The amount of centralized administration can be seen in looking at how much revenue does each state have. All states get their primary income from land-based transactions. All income tax goes to the federal government, and the federal government spells it out. So what happens is the local government is so poor that if you take the state of Penang, up until 2014, largely because the education budget was cut in 2015 onwards, USM had a bigger budget than the Penang state government. The result of the local government not having money is that the local government cannot build infrastructure to support the growth of local industries. And more importantly, there's an absence of independent centers of policy initiatives in this country. Let us remember how industrialization came to Malaysia. Industrialization came to Malaysia was when Lim Chong-yu invited the multinationals into Penang. And he had to do it because in 1970, he wasn't expecting to get too much of a budget from the federal government. So there was an independent policy that was undertaken, which proved to be the right one. The rest of the country copied it. It became a national strategy, and it worked. And in fact, one of the leading explanations for why China has grown so successfully is because of the extraordinary amount of power that has been given to the party secretary of each province. The party secretary of each province effectively has got his own fiscal base, his own revenue, and he uses it to support economic development in his state. And if you look at that in Malaysia, that mechanism is missing. And what happens with this excessive concentration of fiscal power in the federal government is that a lot of it is spent where the federal government is located, right here in the Klang Valley. Pak La tries to address it with his corridors of development, but Pak La did not last long enough. And so now we are back to an unequal spatial pattern of development. Over-centralization in the early years of the federation can be justified in that there were very limited number of educated people. And so since there was such a small pool of competent administrators, you centralized the operations. But now, given the fact that the amount of educated manpower at the state, in the country has increased tremendously, there should be, I think, separate state civil service. Because of the nation began at a time of emergency, and because of confrontasi in 1963, we basically removed the local government from having much policy initiative. But however, this, I think, is a mistake that has to be corrected. Let me take the example of municipal services that are managed from Putrajaya, the bus company. Every bus stop in Penang is picked in Putrajaya, the route and so forth. And it's no wonder that the over-centralization of municipal services has generally resulted in the poor delivery of government services. And not only that, it also prevents the emergence of good leaders to national level. The absence of the ability of the state government to perform means that the ability of a state government to then go on to higher office is greatly reduced, and the phenomena of Jokowi in Indonesia would not be possible in Malaysia. There are many other institutional flaws one could talk about, but this one, I think, is particularly important. It is particularly important because there's a new normal in Malaysian politics as well. I think the days of one party controlling all the states are unlikely to reassert themselves. And if that is true, we got to think of economic institutions that would accommodate, that would permit growth in this new normal of political realities in Malaysia. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Wu. I think your main theme was that we have to start doing things differently. And you ended up your talk by raising a very important subject about over-centralization in the administration and management of the country. I think our colleagues in ideas have also been raising this issue about big government. I think
Not just big data.
not just big data, but big government. Okay, we have heard a number of issues raised this afternoon. Maybe I should ask Tan Sri Kamel, or yes, if you want to say a few quick words before I invite. We go straight to the floor. Eh? Okay, now invite comments from the floor.
It has been very stimulating to listen to Professor Jeffrey Cheah's Kamal Saleh and Professor Wu, and yourself, Tan Sri. We all have been in the game for a long time and have also had sleepless nights, like Professor Kamal said, because we are concerned about these issues. Now, the topic is Reform Program for Dynamic Sustainable Development. My question is, have we reformed sufficiently to sustain ourselves dynamically in the future? And related to that question is, do you believe that the NEP has been replaced by the NEM when there are strong elements, strong currents underlying the so-called NEM, which to my mind is really not implemented? For example, the Prime Minister in his recent budget speech talked about this new concept of carving out and competing. Carving out and competing. Carving out tenders, contracts, government expenditures, so that they can be competitive amongst one sector of the population, which he said, he mentioned in his speech, 70% is Bhumiputra. Now, with that kind of concept, how can we say that the NEP has been replaced? In fact, I would say at this time, one of the debilitating factors in the economy and its prospects is a continuation of the NEP. Would the panel comment, please? Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much, Mohammed Sharif, my former boss of 30 years ago, when you were heading EPU. And I very much enjoyed the presentations of all speakers, and agree almost with all of, there's a common thread running through about low productivity and probably the flight of educated labor and so on. But I missed from each of the speakers any focus on what I see as a major problem that Malaysia is facing. And that is, over the last 20 years, there's been a massive influx of unskilled workers. And how can you talk about raising productivity, increasing wage levels, when there's no attempt to rebalance, as Singapore did 30 years ago, the dynamics of the flows of migrants changing between low-paid, unskilled to higher professionals? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Any other questions from the floor? When Tan Sri Raymond mentioned about carving out, I was thrown out of balance because I've been away. I was not here during the budget speech. I was in Iran for 2 weeks, and I came back with very little idea of what the budget is about. Although yesterday's papers, I began to catch up a bit yesterday. Now, I didn't hear about the carving out 70%. Would you like anybody to comment on that first?
The carving out is not 70%. The 70% is of the Malay Bhumiputra population, of the total population. The carving out is a percentage, like the case just before, just after the announcement of the NEM, and then there is a blowback from the nationalists who wanted to maintain the priority given to Bhumiputras, and therefore the government, in this case Tan Sri Najib's administration, introduced the Bhumiputra empowerment, economic empowerment policy, which is essentially an extension of the NEP in the context of NEM, which tends to be a more liberal approach, a more competitive approach. The carving out exercise was exercised then. Of the total that was allocated for the ETP, for instance, 2 billion was carved, a total of 100 billion plus was needed for the ETP in financing the anti-point projects, EPP. For instance, as announced by Pandu, 2 billion was carved out for the NEEM or NEE, what is it? The BEEP, Bhumiputra Environment Empowerment, Economic Empowerment Policy. So this is actually an extension of that. As I said, it doesn't help. You also agree that it will not help in terms of encouraging entrepreneurship, competitiveness, value-added thinking amongst the Bhumiputra. They are still coddled, protected, and therefore there will be no incentive to change. As I said, that to me the race factor is no longer relevant. To maintain the future of the Bhumiputra, they are 70% of the population. I mean, whatever you do, 70% at least will impact on them. So do the right policies. I have my old friend Din Marikan, your friend too, said, the politics of this country and its impact on the country can only be solved by getting the economics right, not by getting just the politics right. And insofar as your comment on the NEP is concerned, the NEP is the bread and butter of UMNO. And so long as UMNO is the core of the end, NEP will be there. I went through all these various reincarnations. Over the last 40 years, as you know, we go from NEP to NDP to finally NEM. It is still just the NEP in various dresses, accommodating for global changes and issues, but not enough as per what Hu Tai also said just now, that the world is changing so rapidly, technologically, in terms of knowledge, in terms of the digital revolution and so on, and only now we're talking about the digital economy as a priority area in development. But we are dragged down continually by the NEP, and that is what is, I think, to me, an issue, and that's why I spoke out against enough is enough. Just move on to thinking about the country as a whole and releasing, creating the incentives, including, of course, making the right institutions do the right things. Let me answer the second question. Richard Lead raised on foreign labor. There is a mixed evidence that foreign labor's presence contributed to the stagnation of wages, because there are many other factors playing a role. But there is a need for a specific policy about foreign labor. And ever since I know, in terms of Pala institution, we were trying to find ways how to reduce the role of foreign labor in the economy. The trouble is that we've got vested interests that make money off the trafficking of labor. Until recently, government now agreed that employers can directly employ foreign labor rather than go to manpower outfits that bring in and take about 10,000, and for each worker, and for the worker to outlay about nearly all their life saving just to get to this country, and they have their passports impounded by the employer for a long time. So that's. And we tried to do by raising levies. The MEF objected to it, that kind of thing. We tried to introduce what you call the minimum wage for all foreign labor as well as national labor. There was some objection to that. They carve out the issue of domestic labor, because the Indonesians say that you cannot treat our labor differently in terms of domestic services and so on. So all these various factors that make this issue still a tension issue in the country. But until mechanization and technological change is absorbed by industry, this issue of foreign labor will continue to drag on the incentive and wages system in the country.
On the question of letting low-skilled labor into the country, that is a pro-poverty policy. Basically, it punishes the poorest in Malaysia by making sure that the wages doesn't go up for them. The most unfortunate aspect of that is that capital owners, factory owners, did not have to invest in modern machine, because they can just keep the old machine and pay the same thing. But what is equally as bad as the inflow of unskilled labor is the flowing out of skilled labor. And it is many times said that the flowing out of skilled labor is because we need to pay them higher wages and they will come back. But if you look at the survey that the World Bank did in its 2011 studies, it found that the majority of people who left said that yes, money was important, but the future of the children is even more important. They see the existence of barriers to the education of their children, to the promotion of their children. And it is not just their own interests. They were forward-looking, and that is... So given the fact that there is a pull factor outside of higher pay, it is not necessary for us to have a push factor inside the country to help the process along. I think I'd like to mention one aspect of NEP, which is that when it was started, Tun Dr. Ismail said that it would be a 20-year program, largely because being a doctor, he saw the NEP as an emergency room procedure. An emergency room procedure that, if kept repeated, would be very dangerous. It's just that a person comes in with a heart that has stopped, so you give him an electric shock. But after he recovers, you got to get the person to change his diet, change his lifestyle, and possibly come work for JCI and have a less stressful job. And it is not that you just give him another shock as the backup cure. So I think we have the warranty on the effectiveness of NEP has worn off. It is very unfortunate that it also could be read as the NEP standing for no economic progress right now. And but on the other hand, I'm very heartened by that. Most economists I speak to has the exact same conclusion of what Kamal Saleh opened his remarks with. Thank you. But there are many other institutional barriers that need to be.
Habajan from the Malaysian Reserve is a business newspaper. Professor Sesh, you meant, Prof. Sesh, the Malaysian Reserve, sorry.
Oh.
You mentioned about America being anti-scientific, what we gather now. Okay, I get that. But the second comment you made, that there's no planning agency and there's no proper planning. I'm a bit puzzled with that. I mean, this is a nation that has been growing and has been moving about. Can you explain a bit on that one? And if I may just throw one more for Professor Wu, you mentioned about Dr. Ismail and the emergency, you're linking it. Room. Is that your hunch, your guess, or is that something that you read somewhere? Thank you.
Professor Sachs, you painted a very stark, maybe a bit bleak future about the environment, and that we already see now the evidence of disasters of climate change. We've seen it, hurricanes and forest fires in the United States recently, and the huge task of trying to be able to reach by 2050 to not use fossil fuels anymore. If I may inquire, in your experience speaking with governments around the world, which government in the world has actually come up with a potential solution to overcome this huge challenge? It's clearly multidimensional. You have to look on the demand side to use less fossil fuels. You have to look at the supply side and see how you can put in place cars, for example, that are more efficient, energy efficient. But who actually is putting in place a plan that perhaps Malaysia can learn from, that can comprehensively and realistically achieve this great task? Thank you.
Thank you very much for both of the questions. It's interesting that in a formal sense, the U.S. does not have an economy ministry or a planning ministry. So we don't actually have that function in government. Certain ministries have planned traditionally, and probably the one that plans in most detail is the Pentagon. And so there's a very big budget. There is a very systematic planning process. And there is it's certainly the focal point of technological development. It also has been the progenitor of many important civilian technologies, which is notable because in U.S. politics, politicians have readily given funds to the Pentagon for innovation and technology that they might not give to a civilian agency, but then the most famous part of the Pentagon's technology development, the DARPA program, of course, was the office that created the backbone of the internet at the start. And so it was really a Defense Department program that developed the concepts of packet switching and computer networking. And it was then transferred to the National Science Foundation, which created the first email networks and started the internet process. So we strangely find it very hard at this point to have a coherent, forward-looking program. The American government doesn't produce a vision document. It doesn't produce a forward plan. It has certain agencies that are supposed to take a 10-year forward look in the budget, like the Congressional Budget Office, but it's quite different from a forward-looking planning ministry. So I find it a real weakness. When our politics becomes very polarized and disjointed, it all becomes worse, because in the past we've been able to take longer-term commitments on the environment or on the space program or on building the interstate railway or on sequencing the genome, all wonderful projects actually that transcended different administrations, even of different political parties. But that has broken down to a certain extent. The U.S. still has some very wonderful institutions in government, like the National Science Foundation or the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration or NASA, the Space Agency, or the National Institutes of Health. These are among the finest scientific institutions in the world, but they're all under stress right now because the politicians are not properly supporting them. The Trump administration is actively attacking in many cases. And so I find our current state of affairs politically a great weakness and rather alarming, actually. However, when I recommend a 5-year plan in the United States, I'm not greeted with much enthusiasm. It sounds, of course, like a very foreign language and one that is viewed very hostilely in the United States. But I mean it seriously, even if it sounds provocative in American political lingo. We need to reinvent the capacity to look ahead because when you're trying to make major changes to energy systems or to underlying technological systems, there needs to be a way to do this, a place within government that has this responsibility. We don't even have an interagency process to look at the Sustainable Development Goals, even though the U.S. government, like all other governments, is presumptively, I should say, committed to them, though there's no evidence for it. So I mean it not as a joke, but as a serious observation that it's very much weakening America's capacity to be responsible right now, even to its own long-term interests. This relates to the second question, what to do about climate change. Well, when you do analyze that question, you reach the first conclusion that we must move to a low-carbon energy system. The process for doing that is at least a quarter century. This is not possible from 1 year to the next, or even from 5 years or 10 years, to transform from the kind of energy system that all of the countries have to the kind that we need. Our power plants last for decades. Our automobiles last for 20 years. Our buildings last for centuries sometimes. And so making a transition from the current infrastructure to a low-carbon infrastructure requires a capacity to act over the course of 30 or 40 years in a consistent way. Think of it as a downward ramp that gradually phases out the existing high-carbon infrastructure and phases in gradually the new low-carbon infrastructure. So the first thing that's needed is a plan that is going to be implemented over 20 or 30 years. And governments should create such a plan and put them out of year-to-year politics by creating a technical agency and a legal framework that gives the long-term mandate and that creates the long-term vision. Some of our states have done that, most importantly California. And California is the state that has the most developed strategy and the most developed ideas institutionally how to implement such a strategy. And it's not a coincidence that Elon Musk and the Tesla are in California. It's both because of the technological excellence of Silicon Valley and California in general, and the mandate to move to a low-carbon future. Now, many governments are studying the problem, and the team that I direct at the UN Sustainable Development Solutions Network, has also implemented over the last few years a process of studying what we call deep decarbonization pathways. And we've learned a lot by watching and working with about 20 governments now that have made such studies. And they come to roughly the same conclusion about what needs to be done. One part is to convert all of the main answer to decarbonization is electrification throughout the economy and then producing the electricity in a low-carbon manner. So it's a heavy focus on transformation of the energy system from burning coal to using solar, wind, geothermal, hydroelectric power, or nuclear energy. That's the core. And then moving transport from the internal combustion engine to electric vehicles, and implementing energy efficiency as much as possible so that the burden of making that transformation is reduced if you're getting more output per unit of energy input. Then it's easier to make the energy transformation. So we often say there are 3 pillars to decarbonization: low-carbon electricity, electrification of downstream uses, especially transport, and energy efficiency. Who is doing this best? Again, the Scandinavian countries. They're rich, they are green, and they have good alternatives. So they're moving to hydroelectric and wind power And they have plans to the mid-century to eliminate fossil fuel emissions entirely. So Denmark, Norway, Sweden are in the lead of this. And they're already in a process of declaring the goal that major cities should be carbon-free as early as 2025 in some cases. And they're deploying large-scale wind powers and hydropower especially, hydroelectric power. So what Malaysia should do is study what are its assets of renewable energy. How could they substitute? What would the timeline be? And then what kind of policies are needed to support that change? Mostly regulatory, but also adding in a price of carbon, for example. Sweden has put $100 or more per ton of CO2 tax for more than 20 years now. And that has already contributed significantly towards decarbonization. So I was grim, but I wasn't meaning to say it's hopeless. It just requires a big determination. What is the biggest problem, though? It's not technical. The biggest problem is the resistance of the existing interests. So one of the reasons why especially Denmark and Sweden are moving to decarbonization is they don't have much fossil fuel to begin with. The main reason the US is resisting is that we have a big oil industry and we have a big coal industry, and they are very powerful politically. And so it's more the opposition of the incumbents than it is the lack of alternatives of the new technologies that is the biggest barrier. And it's political economy, therefore, not economy directly. When we've made the studies, pretty much consistently, it turns out that for about 1% of national income, that's an incremental 1%, you can pay the extra costs of moving to a low-carbon energy system over time. It's not free, but it's not hugely expensive. But for incumbent enterprises and states that produce a lot of fossil fuel, it's politically resisted.
Thank you very much. I think Professor Jeffrey Sachs, I think you have hit the point, directly, because the biggest challenge to change is, of course, vested interests. That applies to environmental management. It applies to everything. You were talking about over-centralization. I'm not surprised you raised this because you were working in Penang. You were and because I myself have heard the Chief Minister of Penang complain aloud about over-centralization, giving, yeah, I know, all other ministry besars also complain. Now, there was a Harvard Advisory Group study, Professor Sachs, about over-centralization in Malaysia. I think it was led by Dwight Perkins, I think. Okay. He led the group. Now, as an American and with your experience in several countries, what do you feel about the issue about centralization, decentralization, whether it will help in enabling countries to tackle their problems in a more effective way?
I think the very strong answer is it depends. The concept that I like and that I think is a standard concept is subsidiarity, which means try to solve the particular problems at the lowest level of government and politics possible. So if problems can be solved at the household level, leave them to households. If the problems can be solved at a community level, leave them to communities. If the problems can be solved only at a regional level, then the region needs to be involved. If it requires a national solution, then decentralization is harmful. If it requires a global cooperation, then nation states are problematic. And so I think the level of political organization to address particular problems depends on the kind of problem that needs to be addressed. You wouldn't want the local areas to be in charge of all infrastructure because the country needs a national backbone infrastructure. And if it's all left to the local area, there'll never be a rail system that is at a national scale. By the way, don't do decarbonization only at a national scale, because lots of good renewable energy can be shipped across national boundaries. Wind, solar, the electrons move very fast, and it doesn't. And what matters is where the wind is blowing, not where the downstream use is, as long as there's power transmission. So regional integration is quite important. You don't want to have taxes determined at the local level, because then the different states compete for taxes by giving tax breaks to try to attract business, and everybody ends up without adequate tax authority. Or look at, I feel it's an embarrassment of politics right now. Amazon said that they are going to open a second big headquarters in the United States. So they took bids where local areas competed for Amazon by saying, we promise you this, we promise you that. It's pretty disgusting in the end, because Amazon's going to get big tax breaks when it should be paying taxes instead. But it's using its market power to extract from local governments bids when in fact there should be no such competition. There should be a tax rate that Amazon's going to pay no matter where it locates. But instead it's playing a game of one jurisdiction against another jurisdiction. So decentralization can work for certain things, but it's not so good for other things. It can be healthy competition in some areas. It can be quite damaging competition in other areas. I would not recommend going to local taxes of the provinces rather than a national tax system. I would not recommend going to local solutions on energy rather than a national or even a regional grid solution, which is going to be better. But for certain other areas where there may be cultural or other problems or challenges that can best be handled locally, then decentralization brings governance to more accountability at the local level. So like all economists, I gave an answer that is probably useless, but it's not a simple question of yes or no on the level of on the right level of problem solving.
We are now 2 minutes to 6 o'clock, so maybe it's the right time for me to end the session today. I must thank the three speakers for raising very pertinent issues as we plan for the future. I think the global issues raised by Professor Jeffrey Cheah are definitely important, and as I mentioned, Malaysia too is beginning to look seriously at the question of the technology disruption or disruptive technology, because we know that this is going to have a major impact on how we do business in the future. And Professor Wu and Tan Sri Kamal Saleh have also raise the usual questions that we discuss whenever we meet in a forum like this. The need to reform some of our long-standing policies, including not only the NEP, but also the question of labor, question of education, talent management. I think these are the key issues facing Malaysia. Now, I'm sure you'll agree with me that, we have benefited from the discussion today, from what the speakers have said, and can you all join me in thanking them in the usual way? Thank you.